Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm supposed to stall a little bit because there are people caught in traffic, but I don't know how long I can hold you all without getting too restless. So I think we're going to start. We are extremely fortunate in this election season to have two experts who wrote a wonderful book about Hasidic politics in America with us tonight. I think it's fair to say this is a really, really strange election season. Nobody can really predict what's going to happen. Unless we're talking about Hasidic Jews, we can probably predict. But that's strange in a different way because we have all these bizarre contradictions going on. Most Hasidim, and especially the Satmar Hasidim, it's a very large Hasidic community that will be discussed tonight, are going for Trump. You know, they're MAGA. Makes a certain kind of a sense, social conservatism, you know, okay, fine. But that puts them in the same kind of political group as white supremacists who are openly anti-Semitic, right? White supremacists. And somehow there's this coalition happening. And if you think beyond American politics to questions like Zionism, there are even more bizarre configurations, because normally anti-Zionists are thought of as the most left-wing radical members of the Jewish communities. And yet, Satmar Hasidim and really most Hasidic Jews are also anti-Zionist. Maybe in a little different way, but still that's a very strange kind of alliance that you wouldn't normally think of. And even their community itself seems like a paradox. You know, America is supposed to be the melting pot, right? And if you read Nomi Stolzenberg's and David Meyer's book, you will see that it's precisely in America, the melting pot, where this very homogenous, intensely religious community that's insular and almost like a bubble, you know, protected against the outside world, that's where it's formed, not over in Europe, where people tended to live more interspersed with members of different cultures. And so this is all a very strange phenomenon. I hope maybe our speakers will help us begin to make sense of it. Just to give a more formal introduction, Nomi Stolzenberg holds the Nathan and Lily Chappelle Chair in Law at the University of Southern California, USC. And she's the co-author of American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, which won the 2022 National Book Award in American Jewish Studies. She co-authored the book with David Myers, who is distinguished professor and holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History, at UCLA. He also serves as the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy and directs the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. Some fascinating work going on there at UCLA. Any case, please join me in welcoming these two wonderful guests of ours.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Glenn. It's really a delight to be with you all. I feel very much at home here at Fairfield University. I'm a native of Scranton, Pennsylvania, whose anchor cultural institution is the University of Scranton, a Jesuit university, which I actually attended for a year. So I feel very much in sync with the Jesuit mission in life and really admire the intensity of intellectual engagement of Jesuit institutions in our country. So what we're going to do tonight, this afternoon tonight, because we're going to extend late into the night, just a public service announcement, is first of all, alternate in our presentations and sort of adopt micro and macro perspectives on the question at hand, which is, as you see, a slight reformulation from, I think, what appeared on the poster and what Glenn mentioned. We're going to talk about Haredi politics in the United States, and in a second I'll define what Haredi is, but it's closely connected, don't worry, to Hasidic. And we're going to do so on the eve of the election and share with you some of our findings from both qualitative and quantitative research. And we're going to do so because we think that studying this particular group of people tells us something not only about them, but about America, but about politics, and particularly the intersection of politics and religion in the United States. So let me begin with a very preliminary question. Like, why are we interested in this group, Haredi Jews? And there's been a very significant burgeoning of scholarship around Haredi Jews over the last decade or so. Very fine work across disciplines. And it raises the question, why this new interest? And there are a few reasons for that. I'd say the first is because Haredi Jews have become more visible in American culture. They have become more visible, they've become more vocal, notwithstanding their deeply ingrained commitment to live apart from society in a state of self-segregation, even insularity. They have nonetheless taken up the practices of many in American society at large and make use, even though there are taboos on doing so, of social media and other modern communications devices that in many respects reflect the kind of core tension in their lives between that measure of insularity and their full-on belonging to American society. So Haredim have become more visible and more vocal, and it's important to say more numerous. More on that later. But I think what's also interesting and a source of interest for scholars and a general public whose appetite has been fed by a stream of memoirs, of popular nonfiction works, of television programs like Unorthodox. What is, I think, intuitively interesting is the way in which Haredi Jews cut against the mainstream profile or characteristics of the American Jewish community in many ways, in terms of their cultural habits, in terms of their resistance to the forces of assimilation, and in terms of their political behavior, as Glenn alluded to. So tonight we want to do two things. We want to take a closer look at Haredi politics, well, that's the main goal, and we want to do so by first looking at a case study that highlights really the confrontation that Haredi Jews have engaged in on behalf of something that's extremely important to the sustenance of their way of existence, that is to say, education. So I'll say a few introductory remarks and then hand things over to Nomi, who's really going to take up that question of not just education, but public education, or more generally, educational requirements imposed by state institutions on all educational institutions, particularly in the state of New York. And then after that, we're going to zoom out and take a broader look at Haredi political trends and behaviors, and conclude by thinking about what this tells us about America. But let's begin with some very basic introductory framings. The term Haredi, all right, I'm not sure how that happened. The term Haredi comes from the Hebrew word chared, which is found in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, which means tremble, one who trembles in the presence of God. And it is a term that is intended to capture the profound sense of subordination of Haredi Jews to God and their full robust commitment to a life of stringent ritual observance to Jewish law. The term Haredi is often used interchangeably with what once upon a time was the preferred term, ultra-Orthodox, though that term has fallen out of fashion, and is intended to distinguish this particular group of observant Jews from others, including modern Orthodox Jews, for whom the confluence of traditional and secular modern impulses is a desired goal. Not so for Haredi Jews, for whom modernity represents a source of contamination, a potential source of attraction to members of the community away from their very deep religious commitments. So the overarching category that we're going to think of tonight is Haredi Jews, but as a number of colleagues have pointed out, that's really a kind of family name, not a first name, because under the family name there are discrete strands of Haredi Judaism, beginning with Hasidic Jews. Hasidic Jews are a subset of Haredi Jews who are adherents of that very powerful pietist movement that took rise in the latter half of the 18th century, of which Glenn Diner is a foremost world authority, and who are committed to their own distinct ritual practices and leadership norms. Most particularly in Hasidic communities, there is usually a single charismatic figure known as the Rebbe or the Tzaddik, who serves in many respects as a conduit between the human and divine realms, something which is not the case with other strands in the Haredi fabric, such as the Lithuanian or Litvak strand. They are heirs of a different tradition, which once upon a time was steadfastly opposed to Hasidism, steadfastly opposed to Hasidic Jews. In fact, their commitment is to intense, ongoing study of classical Jewish sources. Study is the constitutive act, whereas for Hasidim, action, practice, experience is what is the defining Jewish act. These are two of the strands in that fabric that we're going to describe as Haredi. In Israel, there's another important strand, which is Mizrahi Jews associated with the political party Shas, who represent yet another camp within the Haredi world. So Haredi is a term we're going to use. It's a kind of generic term, and it includes within it Hasidic Jews. The final thing I want to say by way of introduction is an elaboration on what I said just a minute ago, which is there are more Haredim in the world than there were before, and there are going to be a lot more moving forward. And how do we know that? Because there's some serious demographic analyses of Haredi Jews. A colleague of mine, not sure why that keeps skipping. A colleague of mine in the UK, Daniel Statsky, has done a recent survey of the Haredi population, which shows that Haredim constitute 14% of the global Jewish population. That tracks with an earlier study by the Pew Research Center from about a decade ago, which pointed out that Haredim are 13%. That 13% of the U.S. Jewish population are Orthodox, of which 62% are Haredi. Statsky notes that at present there are 700,000 Haredi Jews in the United States out of a Jewish population of 6 million. And what's significant to note is that his estimates suggest that by the year 2040, Haredi Jews will be 23% of the global population. So basically 1 out of 4 Jews in the world will be a Haredi Jew. So we may welcome that fact, we may not welcome that fact, but that's the way it's going to look. And this is going to become an increasingly important part of the profile of Jews around the world, including in the United States. About 92% of Haredi Jews live in Israel and in the United States. 1.2 million in Israel, 700,000 in the United States. So growing numbers, growing visibility, and we might say a growing willingness to assert their political force. Now here I want to make an important point. It's not as if the general attitude of social segregation precluded Haredim from asserting themselves into political processes. This is not a novelty. Really, from the inception of Haredi Judaism, there were intercessors whose job was to serve as representatives of the Haredi community with the secular authorities. That's a tradition that goes back to really the origins of Haredi Judaism. So there's a tradition of accommodation to secular authorities that stands alongside steadfast resistance to engagement with, for example, other Jews. Again, consistent with that general principle of segregation. One thing that we want to keep an eye on is whether, in consonance with that growing visibility and the growing numbers, we are seeing a new degree of not just accommodation, but confrontation on the part of Haredi Jews vis-a-vis secular authorities and, for that matter, mainstream society. That's the proposition that we want to put on the table, that we're going to explore at greater length. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Nomi to begin to talk about one very interesting site of contestation and confrontation in the Haredi world, namely the realm of education.
David said that my portion of the evening's program is going to be devoted to a case study, namely political mobilization around the particular issue of education, which is true. But another way of thinking about what I'm going to be doing in my share of the comments is really offering an origin story about, how did this, in many ways, unlikely alliance, and recently more than an alliance, but really a convergence of Haredi political attitudes and behavior with right-wing, predominantly Christian conservative behavior. How did that come about? Because what's happening today in Haredi political life is really the culmination of a larger story, or maybe we should say a longer story, of a political cleavage that began to emerge within the American Jewish community in the 1960s, which is really sort of the turning point moment when our Orthodox Jews started to gravitate to the Republican Party and to support a more generally conservative political agenda, while the rest of the American Jewish community remained and still remains in the more liberal and progressive camp. And if we seek to understand the causes of this shift among Orthodox and more specifically Haredi Jews, we could look to a multitude of factors and a multitude of policy concerns that might have motivated this. And surely the explanation is not monocausal. And there are many policy issues that drove this change, foreign policy concerns, civil rights and civil liberties issues like concerns about religious liberty, anti-Semitism, public health issues. Think about resistance to vaccination mandates or the resistance that was exhibited to COVID regulations. The list goes on. But as David said, what I want to focus on is one particular set of policy issues that really loom large and that many people who have undertaken to tell the origin story have identified as really the issue that first, back in the 1960s, led the Orthodox and Haredi world to, as it were, defect from what had been a virtual consensus in the American Jewish community in support of more liberal political attitudes, particularly with regard to education. So what I'm going to do is begin by providing, as quick as I can, an overview of current controversies over education in the Haredi world. It's not as quick as it might be because there are a lot of them. There are many. And then what I want to do is situate those controversies in this longer history of political battles and legal battles over education in the United States. So one of the controversies that I'll wager many of you have heard about is the controversy over New York State's substantial equivalency requirement as it applies or as it has not applied to yeshivas. The substantial equivalency requirement, for those of you who may not know, is this is a provision of New York State's education laws. Versions of it have existed for well over a century. And basically, it's a subsidiary component of New York State's compulsory education law that permits private alternatives to public education. So it allows the compulsory education law, which is to say the obligation that all parents have to send their kids to school, to be satisfied either by going to public school or alternatively through private education, so long as the private education provides an education that is, quote unquote, substantially equivalent to that which is provided by public schools. A little over a decade ago, an organization called YAFED formed. YAFED stands for Young Advocates for Fair Education. And this is an organization that was formed by young adults, most of them then I think were in their 20s, who had grown up in the Haredi community and had exited, who feel strongly that they had been deprived of a substantially equivalent education, and more specifically, of a secular education. That the schools they had attended, the yeshivas, in many cases, they asserted, had provided them virtually no secular education at all, greatly disadvantaging them, failing to prepare them for life outside of the world they grew up in. And they began to turn their attention first to lobbying the state and the Department of Education, which they accused of, this law had existed for a century, but had rarely been enforced. So their beef, their battle, was not directly against the schools so much as against the state and the State Department of Education for its alleged failure to enforce this law. That battle is ongoing. In response to this invigorated, or this attempt to invigorate the enforcement of the substantial equivalency law, advocates within the Haredi community equally vociferously emerged to oppose this effort. In particular, an organization called Agudat Israel, oftentimes just referred to as the Aguda. This is an organization formed in the early 20th century that advocates for the interests of Haredi Jews. Not every Haredi group belongs to this organization, But it's fair to say that this is really the chief advocacy group for the interests of Haredim, as we call them. So this battle has been going on for over a decade with the Aguda advocating in defense of the schools and opposing the enforcement of the substantial equivalency law against Yafa's attempt to do just that. The Aguda, interestingly, and I think this is already pointing us towards something important in the history of the evolution and the increasing conservatism of Haredi politics. The Aguda initially and quite immediately was lent support by other groups, in particular the Archdiocese and of New York, and more generally advocates on behalf of the Catholic parochial school system who shared some of the concerns about how the invigorated enforcement of substantial equivalency laws might affect the autonomy and integrity of their educational system. And in fact, many private school groups, associations of secular independent schools also initially were on the same side as the Aguda. Over the ensuing decade, however, virtually all of those other groups reached accommodations with the state. So as of 2022, the Archdiocese announced that it was satisfied that it no longer objects to the enforcement of the substantial equivalency requirements. It's satisfied that that will be done in a way that is not inconsistent with their educational mission. So it really leaves pretty much only the Haredi schools and advocates for that school system in opposition to the enforcement of the substantial equivalency requirements, with the notable exception of many expressions of support, oftentimes by politicians who don't live anywhere near New York State, many of them evangelical Protestants or part of the Christian right more generally, who strongly identify with the cause of insulating the yeshiva system from the reach of state regulation. I'm sure you've also heard about the expressions of support that have come from virtually every mayor of New York City. So Eric Adams, I guess he's still the mayor, is just the last in a long line of mayors. New York City is peculiar in that it's one of very few cities where, rather than the school district of New York City being run by a school board, it's run by a mayor who selects the chancellor, and for reasons that are probably not hard to guess, in terms of bids for electoral support, virtually every mayor has signaled its strong expression of support for the position of the Aguda and the Haredi schools. But that controversy is not only over the substantial equivalency requirements. It's also over the issue of funding. So at the same time that critics of the yeshiva system lamented the absence, the failure to deliver an adequate and substantially equivalent secular education, there's also been, I'm sure you've heard, enormous criticism about the extent to which these schools receive public funding. And that is an issue that cuts across controversies pertaining to both private schools, which is what we've been talking about up until now, and public schools. Because in the same time period that this controversy arose, I'm sure you've also heard of the East Ramapo controversy, which was a controversy not over or not exclusively about public funding for, wrong one? Oh, okay. Is it there? Okay, hard to see over here, thank you. The Yafed controversy is both over public funding going to private schools and the alleged failure of these private schools to provide secular education or an adequate secular education. Another of the controversies is the East Ramapo controversy. Here what we had was outside of New York City, in the suburbs, a very large population of Haredi Jews of different stripes who were accused of, quote unquote, taking over the public school district. Why would they do so, since they send their kids to private school and not to public school? Well, here again, it was very much a funding issue, an issue of public funding, primarily an issue of where publicly funded special educational services would be provided to children in the Haredi community. Do Haredi children have to attend public schools if they have special needs in order to receive the special educational services to which not only are they entitled, but it is mandatory that the state provide them with those educational services? Or can such publicly funded services be provided to children who attend private schools, be they religious or not? And that was the primary interest that motivated the Haredi community in East Ramapo, which prior to these developments had been content to pay their taxes, which would support the public school, but largely stay uninvolved. They decided to actually get elected to the school board. And you can see here, this is what the school board looks like now, very diverse. Huge controversies arose once they succeeded in getting elected and then succeeded in diverting a larger share of the public school, of the East Ramapo School District's budget to the provision of special education services to children in the very extensive private yeshiva system, many different yeshivas in that area. This was hugely resisted and opposed by the very racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically diverse community that patronized the public schools. I'm sure this is familiar to you. Last but not least, of the triptych of school controversies is the case of Kiryas Joel, which is the subject of the book that David and I wrote together, where here you had sort of the inverse of what happened in East Ramapo. If East Ramapo represents the situation in which the Haredi community involved itself in the public school that served a heterogeneous community, an involvement that many, certainly its critics, describe as a takeover of the public school district. In Kiryas Joel, we saw just the opposite. Again, these developments were motivated by concerns over special education, public funding for special education, and where public special education services would be delivered in a time period in which, and this Supreme Court pronouncement did not last, it's since been overturned, but there was a period of 12 years between the mid-1980s and a little bit past the mid-1990s when the Supreme Court held that publicly funded educational services such as Title I remedial educational services or special education, could only be provided to children inside public schools and not in private schools. And what the Satmars of Curious Joel did in response to that judicial decree was to secede from the heterogeneous school district, which they were part of, and form their own separate public school. So you really have this triptych of three different raging controversies all over education. So that's what's going on today. What I want to do in the remainder of my remarks is take us, this is the present, and when I hand things off to David, he's going to return us to the present. But I think in order to understand how did we get here and what brought about the curious alliances that we are considering today, it's helpful to look to the past. And specifically to think about not only how Jews have engaged in the politics over education, but to tell a story about Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. So let me start with Catholics. This might be an audience, or some people in this university might be familiar with something that certainly wasn't known to me. So I'm curious, how many people in this room have ever heard of the great Harvard Law School controversy over the barriers to the admission of Catholics? Anybody? Anybody? Well, this is one of the first controversies over substantial equivalency requirements to have occurred in the annals of American education. Here we're shifting our attention to American higher education. It occurred in the late 1890s and really right around 1900, the turn of the century. What happened? Harvard Law School enacted new admissions policies. It was really the first time there really were any meaningful admissions criteria. Used to be if you went to school and you graduated from high school and you applied, you were admitted. But they're ratcheting up their standards. And as they ratchet up their standards, they decide they need to review the schools from which their applicants graduate. Some of those schools, graduates from some of those schools, those that satisfy the powers that be, that the kind of education they provide is satisfactory, their graduates will be admitted automatically. But if there are schools whose curriculum is different and not, this was the language that was used, equivalent to the education provided by Andover or Boston and Latin, then those students aren't necessarily going to be excluded, but they're going to have to do something else to demonstrate that they qualify. Which schools turn out to be on the lists? Catholic schools, Jesuit schools. So a huge, huge controversy erupts over this perceived discrimination against the Catholic schools. I just want to read a quote, if I can quickly find it, to just see how resonant this is. This is a quote from Charles Eliot, who was then the president of Harvard Law School, and this is what he had to say. The program of studies in Catholic colleges is so different from that pursued in the leading Protestant or undenominational colleges that when a young graduate of a Catholic college desires to enter a Protestant or undenominational college with advanced standing, he finds that his studies have, to a considerable extent, not been equivalent to those pursued in the college which he wishes to enter. So there's a long history to this kind of controversy, which is not exclusive to Jews. So we can already see, I think, the grounds for an alliance between this segment of the Jewish community and certain segments of the Catholic community. Catholics, of course, strenuously objected to this judgment that the education they provided was not on a par with those of Protestant or non-denominational or undenominational colleges. And that concern on the part of Catholics ran parallel to the objections they registered. This is really going back to the mid-19th century when public schools are really being born. And again, a story of New York State in particular. Of course, the public schools were established and designed by the Protestant establishment. Of course, you read the King James Bible. Of course, you did all kinds of culturally Protestant things. But the Protestants were very committed to having their schools be non-sectarian, to having public schools be non-sectarian. They thought that's what a non-sectarian public school was. You read the King James Bible, but you don't exclude Catholics or Jews. Everyone, they really understood that sincerely to be a non-denominational ecumenical form of education, and needless to say, the Catholics didn't see it that way. If you look historically, you can see three different ways, or maybe, let's say three different ways in which Catholics responded to their perception that whether you were talking about primary and secondary schools, public schools, or higher education, what they perceived, not inaccurately, to be sort of the imposition of a Protestant, maybe culturally Protestant, but nonetheless Protestant hegemony. One was to form their own separate school system, right? Form their own parochial schools, form their own system of colleges. That's strategy number one. Strategy number two, with respect to public schools, leave the city and settle in an area, have enough Catholics settle in an area where they form either a majority or a sufficiently large group to be able to exercise influence over their local public school. Sound familiar? It's the East Ramapo strategy. And then the last strategy is to actually try to make public schools more genuinely non-sectarian and inclusive. And by the same token, to make university admission to Harvard or wherever, outside of the separate parallel system of Catholic schools, also be more genuinely inclusive and non-sectarian. We can also tell a story about evangelical Protestants' engagement over these issues. For the most part, evangelical Protestants followed strategy number two, that is to say, most evangelical Protestants lived in areas where they were the majority, sent their kids to public schools, and the public schools and the tradition of educational localism reflected their values. That begins to change after, do I have the Catholics and the evangelicals up there? After Brown versus Board, which is when we start to see an expansion, more evangelical Protestants exiting the system of public education to form Christian academies, or as some would have it, segregation academies. If we sort of move now closer to the present so that I can hand things off to David momentarily, you can understand the homeschooling movement as kind of a continuation of that strategy. And I think that helps us to understand what I alluded to earlier, which is just today we see the staunchest expressions of support for resistance to the enforcement of substantial equivalence requirements against yeshivas coming from evangelical Protestant quarters, particularly that's not small fringe of it, that is calling for increasing, if not complete, deregulation of private education, but accompanied by public funding of private education. Think vouchers, or think even the next step beyond vouchers. In fact, there are some elements of this community who are calling for the defunding and abolition of public education. Let's just get rid of public education altogether and give all that public funding to private schools, but don't regulate them. Okay, so just to wrap this up, I think we can begin to see what the politics are outside the Jewish world, into which that cleavage I began by speaking about at the beginning of remarks fits into. Where are American Jews in this story? Well, up until the 1960s, they were virtually united in their support for public education and for integration. And they are virtually united in their pursuit of higher education. There are hardly any Jews who attend Jewish schools. There were a very small number of Jewish schools prior to the 1960s, and that was essentially an exclusively Orthodox phenomenon. The 1960s are a turning point for Jews, which is marked by the emergence. Agudat Israel, that I spoke about before, had already existed for many decades, but it is really mobilizing to demand public funding for its school system. In 1961, the head of Agudat Israel testifies before Congress, speaking out in favor of the importance of public funding for religious schools, a cause that, of course, unites Jews with evangelical Protestants and Catholics who are arguing for the same. Why in the 1960s? Because it's in the 1960s that for the first time, the Supreme Court, in roughly the same time period as the famous school prayer decisions, it not only says that we must get religion out of public schools, but we must get public funding out of religious schools, right? And that's really a project that doesn't really begin in earnest, actually until 1971 with the notorious case of Lemon v. Kurtzman, which just a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court just overturned. So there's enormous apprehension in the 1960s that public funding for religious schools is going to disappear. So this is a turning point. That is the moment, and that is the cause which led to that initial cleavage, which led to the separation of Orthodox Jews and organizations like the Aguda that bring them into alignment with conservative Christian organizations. So with that, I think we can understand better how we got to the present moment, which David will tell us more about.
Thank you, Nomi. So what Nomi has done is really zoom in on the domain of education as a reflection of a kind of intuitive alliance between Christian and Jewish religious conservatives. What I'd like to do now is to zoom out, beginning by looking at some very important political trend lines that we see in the Haredi community, and then making our way back to that alliance that has become fortified and that may well exert a very important influence on the future of the United States. So what I want to begin by calling our attention to is this set of data. And here I want to mention my friend and partner in the work of surveying Haredim and modern Orthodox Jews to understand better their political norms and habits. Mark Trencher, who actually is with us in the audience, the president of Nishma survey organization, the Nishma Survey Organization. Mark has been engaged in surveying Orthodox Jewry for a good number of years, and we have recently joined forces to home in on political behaviors and attitudes of Haredim today and over time, as we will see. The first thing that I want to call attention to is how important local elections are for Haredi Jews. And here, just to remind us, Haredi Jews are those for whom modernity represents a very conscious threat to their mode of existence, as distinct from modern Orthodox Jews, whose guiding image, quite literally, is the confluence of, as they would say, Torah umada, traditional Torah learning and science, representing the modern world. Modern Orthodox Jews want to affect an engagement between tradition and modernity, whereas Haredi Jews want to hold on to tradition as much as possible. We've surveyed both, and what we've discovered is that there's a great deal of interest on the part of both groups, but particularly Haredi Jews in local elections, because issues like education are decided or can be very seriously influenced at the local level. And we can also get a sense here, especially on the right, of the proclivities, the political proclivities of the two groups of Jews. Haredi Jews in particular are our interest. Over 60% tend to vote Republican, which is, as we'll see, a relatively small number compared to what happens in national elections. That is to say, there's a relatively larger degree of latitude to depart from the political profile when Haredi Jews vote at the local level. Okay. What kinds of things concern or of interest to Haredi Jews? What I want us to focus on in particular, as we see, there's a great deal of similarity between the two groups until we get to the fourth item on the right, which is the realm of education and the interference of the state, the perceived interference of the state in imposing its educational requirements on Haredi Jews. 34% of Haredi Jews say that's the single most important determinant when they go to vote in local elections. This is a very important factor for Haredi Jews. And it is something that brings them out to vote and that allows them or compels them to mobilize their substantial political capital. How do they do that? How do they mobilize? One way is by forging alliances with significant political figures in the realms in which they live. Here we see a picture of a representative of the Haredi community with Governor Hochul of New York, and on the right with Mayor Adams. Haredi Jews, in order to affect their interest, to secure benefits to their community, forge alliances. Thank you. Forge alliances with politicians, and that's a tradition that extends back to really the first decades of Haredi Judaism in the late 19th century. That's not a tradition born in America, but it's a tradition that has become perfected. In addition to forging alliances with local and state politicians, Haredim tend to exercise great discipline in voting as a bloc, such that they can really leverage their numbers to the benefit of the community. Okay, so this is what things look like at the local level, and we'll see that there's an interesting juxtaposition to the way things look at the national level. And that's in two regards. One, there's greater latitude at the local level for Haredim to depart from their general conservative political priorities and not vote with the Republican Party. And second, their behavior or patterns of voting in presidential elections is really the inverse of that of non-Haredi Jews, which is to say, if you see on the left the history of Jewish voting for presidents in presidential elections since 1980. In only one instance did Jews not vote for vote in a majority for a Democratic candidate. That was in 1980. The almost exact opposite is true of the voting habits of Haredim. In only one instance, that is to say in the Clinton-Dole election, did Haredim not vote in a majority for the Republican presidential candidate. And as you see, very often, Haredim vote in the range of 80% or more for Republican political candidates. So that's quite different from their proclivities at the local level, very significantly higher, and reflects, I think, an important juxtaposition that has been noticeable between a kind of transactional, non-ideological voting pattern at the local level as against and decidedly solid ideological commitment at the national level. One question that we want to put on the table is that transactional, non-ideological, pragmatic approach to voting likely to survive as new alliances are forging between Haredim and other religious conservatives? Just to put things in something of a greater relief, here we see data about the voting habits of a wide range of Americans, including Jews. We see on the left the data from the Pew Research Center study of 2021, which shows that a very substantial number of Jews, 68%, are aligned with the Democratic Party, as distinct from Haredim, which, if you see in the center at the bottom, 85%, if we exclude independents and other parties, 85% identify with the Republican Party. So in some sense, an inverse relationship between non-Haredi Jews and Haredi Jews in terms of their national political proclivities. What is important and interesting to us is the way in which, of various groups in American society, the voting habits of Haredim rhyme or are consonant with that of evangelical Christians. Again, very consistent with what we have been talking about here, but here there's some measure of statistical overlap that is worth noting. Again, suggesting that these two groups, Protestant evangelicals and Haredi Jews, are allies in their commitment, their very strong commitment to the Republican Party based on their shared adherence to conservative political values. Okay. Now let's look at where things may be headed in a few short weeks as we move towards the election. You can see that in contrast to modern Orthodox Jews, who are more split down the middle, Haredi Jews of different age groups and genders are overwhelmingly committed to vote Republican, in over 90%. In the survey data that we have collected suggests that they are going to vote for Republican candidates. Again, you can see how that finds a parallel with one group in particular, namely evangelical Protestants. So this leads us to ask whether we are witnessing not just the forging of or fortification of a political alliance that has roots earlier, as Nomi suggested, in the 1960s, but really, in a certain sense, the evangelicalization of Orthodox and particularly Haredi Judaism. We should note here the kinds of issues that animate Orthodox Jews at the national level. They are overwhelmingly concerned with Israel, with anti-Semitism, and those are issues that are conjoined. The two groups of Jews, observant Orthodox Jews, hold to those two issues as central as central sources of concern. But we see some divergence, especially when we look at the weighting given to crime and, again, education on the part of Haredi Jews. Those are issues. That issue set, if we look at the right table, those issues, that set of issues, has a very significant overlap with the concerns not just of conservative Republicans, but conservative religious Republicans. And it really amplifies for us the point about the not just theoretical alliance between Jews and Haredi Jews and evangelical Protestants, but the actual connections that are being made between the two groups. Not only do they write friend of the court briefs on behalf of the cases brought by the other group, but there are also increasing contacts between them, as we see in that picture on the right, which is a picture taken of Haredi Jews and a group of evangelical bikers in Israel. And this leads to the last point I want to make, which is consistent with the fortified alliance between Haredi Jews and evangelicals, the growing centrality of Israel and even Zionism, what we might call, alongside the evangelicalization, the Zionization of Haredim. Professor Diner mentioned that Haredi Jews, as a general matter, have been either overtly hostile to Zionism in the state of Israel or completely non-committal, either anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. The largest, or one of the two largest Haredi groups in the world, the Satmar Hasidim, have long held to the belief that Zionism was a profanation of God's name by its attempt to push the hand of God into returning the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland in advance of the arrival of the Messiah. But we see some striking data that suggest that both modern Orthodox and significantly Haredim feel deep connections to Israel, quite in contrast to the theological foundation of Haredi anti or non-Zionism, even identifying themselves as Zionist in some respect. And I think this is something that we are seeing in younger generations of Haredi Jews. The original message of anti-Zionism that was so deeply ingrained in them is beginning to fade, giving way to actual trips to Israel, in which they get to know the country, oftentimes feel at home in the country, in ways that would be unimaginable in earlier generations. So that shift, I would suggest to you, is important not only in and of itself, but as part of that growing alliance between Haredi Jews and Protestant evangelicals, for whom Israel is one of the most significant issues on which they vote. On the bottom right, you see here Pastor John Hagee, the founder of an organization called Christians United for Israel, a leading evangelical organization that advocates for the state of Israel, and in particular for a kind of territorial maximalism for the state of Israel, which is to say supports a very right-wing agenda, quite consonant with the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu in his current government. So that Zionization of Haredim is really part of a larger process of what we might call Americanization in an interesting and perhaps counterintuitive way. So to wrap up, I want to just conclude by highlighting some of the findings that Mark and I have come to, as well as some of the conclusions that Nomi and I have been thinking about. First, Haredim are solidly Republican at the national level. Second, Haredi Jews over their time in the United States have adopted a practice of a kind of transactional politics at the local level. Third, there's a great deal of concern amongst Haredim about the realm of education in the United States, and increasingly about both Israel and anti-Semitism. All of this, I think, helps us understand what I think is going to become a significant cultural and political force, which is the political partnership of religious conservatives, Christian and Jewish, and it's going to be very interesting to ask if Muslim conservatives are going to join that partnership. The questions that we place on the table for further consideration and research is, can that political partnership alter the shape of Jewish politics, especially given the fact that Haredi Jews are going to become a much larger portion of the overall Jewish population? It's reasonable to assume that that longstanding tradition of Jewish support for Democratic presidential candidates will shift over the next half century or so. And it's also important to ask what the impact will be on US politics of that coalition. As Naomi mentioned, there is a desire on the part of many Christian conservatives to defund public education. The Supreme Court, in its current or perhaps future iteration, may well go along with that. And that would be one way in which this very potent political movement of religious conservatives has really altered and will continue to alter the shape of America. What does this look like in the immediate term? Well, Haredi Jews are quite aligned with the MAGA agenda, and as we have seen, are very likely to vote overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. What remains an open question is whether the alliance of religious conservatives, including Haredim, will even more forcefully alter the landscape of the United States, and whether it will reshape in the process the American Jewish community. Both of those propositions appear likely, but time will tell, and we look forward to reporting back to you at a later date. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks so much. We can now take a few questions. If it's okay, I could lead off. I know this is going to sound incredibly naive, but it used to be that character mattered in politics, right? And the whole thing about Bill Clinton that was so outrageous was that he had these personal failings. So that's just completely gone by the wayside? Was it never there? Was it always? I mean, it seems like it's transactional on the national level too, if you think of it in those terms.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's certainly transactional in the sense that religious conservatives oftentimes have to swallow their disdain for the character flaws of the individual in the name of gaining benefit or achieving a higher degree of resonance with a set of values that they believe can sustain their way of life. So that at one level is another instance of pragmatism, though I think it reflects more broadly the belief, which evangelical Protestants represent as well, that what the imperfect carrier will bring is not just a sort of the elimination of a requirement, but a new political and cultural world, a reshaped world in which they can realize their community's ambitions and aspirations in ways that they hadn't imagined before. And in that regard, it may be that the difference, is a really perceptive question, Glenn, it may be the difference is not is it transactional versus ideological? It's a mix of both. But really, how expansive the vision is, how expansive the rewards, how completely fulfilled the worldview of these communities can be through the actions of that bearer. It may be a question of scale, though it is interesting to note there's almost no variation in support for Republicans, and there's a lot of variability at the local level. As you see, Haredim were very supportive of Eric Adams. He was the conservative candidate in the race. But I will just maybe offer an anecdote that, in some sense, I think instantiates your claim. A group of Satmar Hasidim in Kiryas Joel, whom I was friendly with, told me about a time when they were summoned to Washington, D.C., to the office of then Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, who brought them in and said, now listen here, boys. It was all men. I really would like you to vote, get your community to get out and vote for a guy named Rick Lazio, who is running against Hillary Clinton for the United States Senate. Because Lott knew of the general Republican voting patterns of Haredim at the national level. And they looked at him somewhat perplexed because Rick Lazio was behind by 30 or 40 points in the polls, and this didn't fit their interests. They go with winners who can deliver, especially, and we'll say at the local and state level, and United States senators can deliver at the local and state levels, but are also national figures. And Lott looked back at them after they sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, I'm not sure we can do that. He said, well, listen here, boys. If you come out for Rick Lazio, I promise you that I will support the state of Israel till my dying day. Now, what's funny is he didn't know of their deeply ingrained anti-Zionism. So this is like exactly the wrong thing to say to them. It was a reflection both of his awareness of, he knew a lot about them, but he didn't know a lot about them. In that case, they voted for Hillary Clinton not because she or her husband represented the value set that they wanted to uphold, but because she could bring very tangible benefits, very tangible material benefits. It's a little bit different at the presidential level. But I think you're right to point out that there's no small element of transactionalism there as well.
I have a quick question. It's almost counterintuitive that your statistics indicate that Haredi Jews vote Republican. Now, I don't know much about the Haredi communities outside of New York, but there is a substantial amount of Haredim in Brooklyn and Queens. Now, they vote Democrat, do they not? They are dependent on the state Democrats and the city Democrats for their funding for presumably their use in secular education, which really doesn't exist. So does your statistics say that that group, which is significant, votes Democrat in city and state
at the local level,
vote Republican in the national level? Right.
That's the.
And
that's exactly the point. At the local level, at the local and state level, there's much more latitude given to vote for the candidate who will deliver the most benefit to the community. At the national or presidential level, there's much more of an ideological commitment to vote Republican.
So
there's much more variability at the local level.
So you're saying that those Haredim in New York, in that densely populated area, split their ticket between the local and state and the national level.
That's right. That's right.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Secondly, in your presentation, you used the word alleged about the misuse of funds in the yeshivas that don't go into secular education. It's not alleged. There have been state audits and city audits that definitely prove the misuse of funds, and that these yeshivas are producing students who can't interact outside of their community. And unfortunately, the reason why it's not pursued is because of votes. Thank you.
I just want to add one point, because notice that we've sort of taken for granted that a lot of what motivates Haredi voting behavior, which frankly is a lot of what motivates many communities' behavior, is an interest in the benefits that politicians will deliver, meaning the government is going to provide funding of one kind or another, or some other kinds of concrete benefits and grants. And I think that bespeaks one important aspect of this emergence of, or convergence of Haredi, not only political behavior and attitudes with conservative Christian attitudes, which we haven't remarked on, because it really, I think, actually reflects a difference, a change in the ideological complexion of conservatism outside the Jewish world. Time was when one of, if not the single most sort of, bona fide elements of being an ideological conservative is that you were opposed to, the democratic policies of tax and spend. You are opposed to government handouts. For a long time, indeed until pretty recently, to be ideologically conservative meant to sign on to that. And that has never been, quite to the contrary. There's been a consistent, there's been no opposition to the welfare state, to tax and spend, to the provision of government funding. So I just think it's important to highlight that. And to a certain extent, it really, as I said before, bespeaks a change in kind of mainstream non-Jewish conservatism, that it too has to a great extent kind of discarded the opposition to a more interventionist, welfarist, provider of benefits kind of state. And I think that's another factor that might be facilitating this increasing convergence.
I'm going to add one quick point on sort of the unholy alliance, we might say, between Donald Trump and Haredi Jews. What is that about? As we see, support for Israel is very important, even for those who define themselves as non-Zionists. They feel increasingly connected to the state of Israel and may end up being the last Zionist standing in Israel and elsewhere. Second, Trump represents a kind of anti-deep state sensibility that resonates with Haredim, and in particular after the government regulations on COVID, which were seen as a grievous assault upon the Haredi way of life. Donald Trump was seen as sort of the champion of the view that the paramount liberty in the United States, and this is why he resonates so for both Christian and Jewish conservatives and why it's ideological. The paramount liberty is religious freedom. It supersedes, it surpasses public health concerns and virtually any other right accorded to Americans. The right to religious liberty. Very important, very ideological. Trump, imperfect as he was in their eyes, delivered that, and he delivered it big time. And then, now to turn to the transactional, Donald Trump was seen by many in the Haredi community in New York as a hero because he commuted the sentence of a man named Shlomo Rubashkin, who had been imprisoned for his part in hiring illegal, undocumented aliens undocumented people at a meat slaughtering plant in Postville, Iowa, and was sentenced to 30 years in jail, which many in the Haredi community believed was completely unfair, biased, and anti-Semitic. Trump commuted the sentence of Rubashkin and helped push forward a program that allowed for easier commutation of first-time offenders, of which there are more than a few in the Haredi community, to go to your point about misuse of funds. If one goes to the state prison in Otisville, New York, one can get a daily minyan at virtually any time in the morning. That's a really important concern to Haredi Jews. And Trump is perceived as having delivered in that regard. So there's a mix really of the transactional and the ideological that I think undergirds that commitment. Hello.
Hi, David. Hi, Naomi. Welcome to Fairfield. It's great to see you. I wanted to ask if you could map the trends that you're pointing out here in the US by perhaps imposing them on more global political trends. Here I'm thinking about the concept of a liberal democracy. It seems pretty clear that we're highlighting some pretty profound tension between democratic principles and liberal principles within the Haredi community, so that they love participating in elections, but primarily to undermine liberal principles such as separation of church and state, anything having to do with secularism, perhaps. I'm sure the list goes on and on. And so would you say that this community has some kind of inherent principled commitment to democracy at the expense of liberalism? Or even is their commitment to democracy questionable if they're going whole hog at the national level for Donald Trump, who clearly has shown himself to be somewhat indifferent to the principles of democracy?
So I'm sure David has more to say about this. I don't think there's simple yes or no answers. Like, I don't think that would be too sweeping to say they have no principled commitment to democracy or they have no principled commitment to liberalism. I think it's more complicated than that. But one thing I would really highlight is the following. The consensus that existed amongst American Jews before this cleavage emerged in the 1960s was that the least hostile environment for Jews is not just a democracy, but a liberal democracy, and more importantly, a secular democracy. There really was an incredibly strong belief in the principle of separation of church and state that was animated to a considerable degree by the widely held belief that a non-secular government, a non-secular society, more specifically a Christian society, that wouldn't be good for Jews. And I think the cleavage okay, it begins with one little breach in the wall of separation between church and state. You can make the case, you can come up with justifications for public funding, for certain, building and maintenance grants for religious schools, or even for vouchers that don't necessarily undermine the secular character of the country that is providing those public benefits. But I think, I wonder if there aren't, I'm curious, this is a question I would love to see you, ask in the next survey. I think, and I do think this is a global trend that we see in many illiberal democracies. I think there is an increase, because you would think, well, surely Jews aren't, how could they team up with Christian nationalists? Surely they're gonna understand that will be bad for them as Jews. I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think there are many Jews and many religious minorities of other religious persuasions who no longer believe that the best thing for them as a religious minority is to live under a secular system of government. That they actually have come to believe that living in a, Christian nation may be better for the Jews than living in a secular one?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Gav. I want to elaborate on what Naomi said, but call attention to important generational differences. So I remember when researching our book in Curious Joel, I would always ask Satmar Hasidim two questions. One, how would you describe your existence in the United States? And two, do you believe yourself to be dwelling in a state of exile? And almost to a person, people would say that they believed the United States was, and this is the term of choice, a malchus shel chesed, a kingdom of grace unique in the annals of the Jewish diaspora, insofar as it enabled and entitled a degree of religious liberty that had not been seen previously. And it was precisely a secular democracy where the establishment of religion was prohibited that allowed for that freedom. And to a person, the people whom I asked said, yes, I believe I'm in a state of exile, and I fervently hope for Messiah to come and redeem me, at next hour. So there is a certain tension built in. But what I think is really significant, gets to the heart of your question, there are generational shifts underway, and they're tectonic. What we see that we did not see foregrounded in earlier generations is the prominence of cultural issues that would seem to have no bearing on the Haredi community, like trans identity issues. That set of cultural issues has a degree of prominence in the Haredi community that one finds surprising, given that the phenomenon doesn't really exist within the community. The sense that the deep state exists and it constantly intrudes upon the individual and the discrete, holistic community seeking to live its religious life without interruption, that's become a very important principle in the community. And a lot of that kind of new perspective comes to the Haredi community through social media. Younger generations of Haredi Jews are increasingly connected to the world out there, in conversation with conservatives out in the world through social media. And one effect and cause of that is the declining authority of the traditional leadership structure, which is happening as young, new renegades emerge, call for spontaneous demonstrations against COVID restrictions, make their way to Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. We have Haredi Jews who are there, MAGA Haredi Jews. So I think there is a more than a dose of that kind of oxymoronic, illiberal democratic impulse that has emerged amongst younger generations. At the same time, that there's a kind of intra-generational tension between those who aspire to greater connection to the world out there, and particularly to the anti-deep state religious conservatives, and those who react against them by saying, we need more insularity and segregation, and turn off your phone and listen to your Rebbe who tells you you shouldn't make use of social media. So there's far more dynamism and diversity within this community, but there certainly is a very pronounced illiberal democratic current at work. Oh, you and you? Oh, yeah, and this gentleman too.
Thank you. Would you comment on the increasingly close relationship that Hasidic Jews in New York, greater New York area, have developed with those in Jerusalem and Israel? There's a recent Tel Aviv University poll that said all 152,000 registered Jewish Republicans will vote for Trump. This came out about a month ago. And There are many Jews in Monsey, Airway, Kiryat Joel that are on airplanes on Thursday, twice a month, for Shabbat with their relatives. There's been a big movement to send the kids to Israel, the Mir Yeshiva, if you know what that is, representing Gur, Babovich, Satmar, is half American now.
Yeah.
And that's 30,000 kids. So 15,000 boys are going to Israel from these communities to study and to be, ingrained in the Israeli way of life.
Yeah, so again, this reflects what I call the Zionization of Haredi Jews. It's kind of a soft process. It's not as if people are getting out there and say, I fervently declare I'm a Zionist. It occurs in different ways. It occurs in the first instance because of familial connections. The Teitelbaum family, that is the leading family of Satmar Hasidism, has ample representatives, family representatives in Israel, even though Israel is regarded as in some sense, impure. But many Satmar Hasidim make their way because they have family connections, and many of them send their sons to learn in yeshiva, not just Mir, but other yeshivas in Israel. That brings them, the parents, to Israel, and they discover it's a more interesting place. Like you can get a wider range of good kosher food on Passover. Things like that, really. The way I see it is there are multiple circles, concentric circles of attitudes towards Zionism in Israel within the Haredi community. The inner circle is the circle comprised of the true believers who adhere to the perspective of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, the founding Rebbe of Satmar Hasidism, in his book Vayel Moshe, which is sort of the leading Jewish anti-Zionist tract of the 20th century. And every year on High Iyar, on the 5th of Iyar, Israeli Independence Day, one in the Satmar world, one devotes oneself to studying that book. Some of the more radical members of the Haredi community in Monsey come to Kiryat Joel and burn an Israeli flag from time to time. That's the inner circle. Then outside of that, the second circle is those who have such reverence for Rabbi Yolish, for Joel Teitelbaum, that they kind of give voice to his views, even though over time they've sort of lost some of the fervency of their beliefs. They still will say it's dirty over there, it's impure, there's a mixing of genders, it's not to my taste. Then you have the adventurers who surreptitiously escape from that anti-Zionist worldview to discover what Israel's like, and it's more interesting. They think it's like, it's not so dirty, it's not so bad, it's kind of interesting. And then you have the outer circle who are fervent Zionists, who are like Haredim who have been many times, who say, I really like it here. They wouldn't describe themselves as Zionists. They would describe themselves as strong supporters of Israel, and indeed would hinge their votes on a candidate's support for Israel. That's why we have discovered that 93% of Haredim in our survey say they're going to vote for Trump. And as we said, his position, I would say somewhat ironically, on anti-Semitism and Israel, those positions are the chief motivating factors. So we have seen really a monumental shift in attitudes that reflect this ongoing process of Zionization, which also is underway in Israel as well. There are deep tensions between different factions of Haredim, traditional, what are called the new Haredim, but I think a similar movement toward a greater alignment between personal disposition and political attitude, both of which are quite conservative.
So I want to ask you about transactional voting, but maybe from a slightly different angle. Is there any, have you studied whether these voting patterns hold the same in swing states versus non-swing states? And the reason that I'm asking is that it's easy to see how local voting is almost always transactional because your vote matters. But on the national level, if you live in New York or California, effectively, and I don't want to say your vote doesn't matter, but effectively your vote is cast for you by the population. And it's a whole different thing to say there's a transactional nature to the vote where your vote definitely matters. But in a national election, if you live in a place where your vote effectively doesn't matter, there is no transaction. So what's happening on the level of the swing states?
That's a really interesting proposition that in some sense is undermined by the demographic reality, which is that Haredim don't live in swing states. They live in New York, California, and Florida. Yeah.
There's no transaction because,
At the local level, there is.
but in federal, there's no transaction.
Right.
So is that an excuse for it not to be transactional because there isn't?
But that was the finding, that it's more transactional and therefore more variable on the local level.
Right.
And less,
So to speak, because where there's no transaction, then
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly the point, that Haredim feel the luxury to vote their heart at the national level because in some sense, here's the important point, it matters less. That's the point, it matters less than what occurs, or it has. That may be changing. It has. So,
how would they vote in a non-swing state?
how would they what?
How would they vote if they lived in a non-swing state? They vote the same if they lived in a non-swing state.
In a swing state.
I'm sorry, yes.
If they voted in a swing state. Yeah. Right. Well, that's a very interesting question that is a complete counterfactual because, as I said, they don't live in swing states, which is its own interesting statement. But I think your point is well taken that, what's that? There's an Orthodox population in Pennsylvania that, for example, the Orthodox Union is making a big effort to get out. Relatively small Haredi population that will not be dispositive. The modern Orthodox population in the surrounding counties of Philadelphia could alter the balance, but so we just should make sure we know which group we're talking about. I think the supposition is correct that if it's a matter of voting their heart, my strong surmise is that's what we see at the national level, and yet it turns out that sort of the heart doesn't always win out in shaping political behaviors and attitudes. The head does sometimes, and that's why we see such variability at the local level.
but this really may be the change over time story. So it's not only that national politics mattered less and maybe continue to matter less than local politics at any given point in time, but I think there's evidence to suggest, although David's research project is still in the course of documenting this, that national politics have begun to matter much more. In other words, in earlier decades, and honestly not that long ago, there was much less interest in presidential politics and national politics, not just because there was less to get out of that piggy bank or dole out of benefits or what have you. It just wasn't of interest. And you can see this particularly if you look, of course, this is only one of the communities, but the Satmars, which are the largest community, the subject of our book. I think the Bush v. Gore election, right? We were consumed. There was very, very little attention paid to that election. They were consumed with their own internal schism. And within the community, there was sort of a curious parallel of, each faction purported to have elected its candidate to be the head of the Williams. That's where the attention was. It just didn't matter that much. I think not only because you get more goodies out of the local level. And so this is something I think quite new, that that people have anything in their heart about the issues, and in particular, as David said, the cultural issues that are front and center in national level ideological politics. This is new.
Yeah, I would say just to build on that, it reflects a sense that something has gone terribly wrong in the United States. Something has gone terribly wrong. And perhaps the course of that liberal democratic tradition that had so enabled and entitled Haredi Jews may be reaching its end. And what the Christian conservative movement offers is really a radically alternative vision of America. And that is, I think, of growing appeal. As Naomi said, I think many in the Haredi community would say it'd be better to live under a Christian regime than under a liberal democratic regime, because there would be an appreciation for what we regard as the foremost right and liberty we have, which is religious liberty. This is a view that, by the way, I've heard not just in the Haredi community, but within certain sectors of the modern Orthodox world. And here I'd call attention to a guy by the name of Yoram Chazoni, who's one of the leaders internationally in what's called the National Conservative Movement, which is really another name for the liberal democracy movement. He himself is close to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and Orban's associates. And in a number of his books, he basically expresses great veneration for the ongoing Christianization of America, which he believes will be good for his notion of Judaism. And I think that's something, although not articulated in precisely those terms, has increasing resonance in the Haredi community.
Okay, with your permission, we'll take one more question. This questioner has great protexia, so.
Protexia goes a long way.
I basically have two questions. First, sorry.
And I have three answers. I have three answers, yeah.
Okay. The movement primarily in the South to bring Bibles back into public education and to eliminate Holocaust courses in the public schools. Again, I have a hard time understanding why the Jewish community would welcome that. Okay. That's question number one. Question number two is, yes, I understand on a national basis they believe that there's Republicans represent a potential for favoring the state of Israel. But what happened to the BS factor in what they're hearing? Why are they drinking the Kool-Aid?
Can you define the BS factor for me? Just give a line of explanation of what you mean by that.
The person who's representing the Republican Party, as Glenn pointed out, an immoral character, but at the same time has no real credibility to deliver what he talks about. And I don't understand why they don't see through that.
Take up the Bible. And
Yeah, okay, I'll address the first question. So remember I said the 1960s are the turning point, both for Jewish politics, the emergence of this cleavage, the emergence of a internal conservative position, defection from the sort of consensus in favor of liberalism. And it's also a turning point. It's the turning point, I would say, in American politics. That is when the Christian right is mobilized, right? So many people, the standard story oftentimes is it was Roe v. Wade that was the spark that ignited the alliance, which was totally unlikely up until that point, between evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics. That's not true. It was over a decade earlier with these not reproductive rights cases, but religion clause cases. But to answer your question, in the 1960s, this is the period of time in which the Supreme Court really articulated and began to enforce the principle of separation between church and state, which really had never been done before. And there are two sides to that. One side was, so the first thing the Supreme Court did was it said, get devotional Bible reading out of the schools and get prayer out of the schools. That was one side of it. The other side of it was no public funding for religious education. And those two things were linked. They were viewed as two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same wall, separating church and state. So you could think of it as kind of a deal. We lose the funding for private schools, but we get Christianity out of the public schools. I think there are a lot of people who say, Jews, who say, I'll take that deal. I'd much rather have public funding for our religious school system, particularly if in the name of religious liberty and parental rights, we can get the public funding unaccompanied by intrusive regulation of our private schools. So we'll get the funding without the regulation. And if I have to put up with some religion in the public schools, I'll take that deal. Number one, we're not going to send our kids to the public schools. Number two, as David was saying, and this really is the Yoram Hazony position, I actually think we'll flourish better. They want to do their Christian thing. That's not a threat to us.
Boy, if I could answer your second question, I guess I'd be a wise person, because I asked the question, what do 75 million Americans see when they look at Donald Trump, not just Haredi Jews? And I must confess, I'm confounded. There's, as we called a very fancy term, there's a kind of epistemological divide. We just process the world differently. People are seeing something quite different than what you and I are seeing. What is it they're seeing? They're seeing someone who, I'm speaking now of Haredi Jews, brought economic prosperity. They're seeing someone who delivered on his promise to bring religious liberty, to erode the barrier between religion and state, to expand the role of religion in the public square, and thus Bibles in schools is completely consistent with that. If it's Bible in schools today, it's public funding for private religious schools tomorrow. Very clear. And I think there's also a sense that I've heard that he gets Jews. He has some appreciation of kind of what makes Jews work. I would say, and he articulates that by lapsing into the basest anti-Semitic stereotypes you could imagine. But for some, there's a perception he gets Jews, and he will stand up for Israel till his dying day, which is such a curious echo of that story about Trent Lott, because that's become really important, even dispositive. In an ironic way, Trump for Haredim represents the confluence of their hearts and minds. Their hearts, their belief he's genuinely conservative in ways that they can appreciate, even though an imperfect being, and he delivers. It remains a source of profound perplexity to me to fully wrap my mind around it. But I think it's a phenomenon that we are going to be studying for a very, very long time. What explains not just the appeal, but really the immunity that Trump has relative to other political figures to say things that would fell any other person within 2 hours. There's some quality. Some charisma, some spell, and it turns out that Haredi Jews have completely succumbed to it. Thank you.